The crystal wine glass chimed, a sharp, high-pitched sound that cut through the chatter of the dining room. My mother beamed, her hand resting on my sister Sarah's shoulder like she was presenting a prize show dog at Crufts. Sarah's venue is finally locked in for October, Mom announced, her voice projecting to the back of the room to ensure the cousins in the kitchen heard her. It's going to be the event of the season. Honestly, we're thinking about pitching it to a bridal magazine, so, Elena... She turned her gaze toward me, her smile tight and polite, the way one smiles at a distant relative they can't quite place. When are you finally going to settle down? You're not getting any younger, and we'd love to have another reason to celebrate. A few cousins chuckled nervously into their napkins. My father kept carving the turkey, his eyes fixed on the meat, like it was the most interesting thing in the world. But I didn't look down. I didn't shrink away. I set my fork down with a deliberate clink against the fine china. I already did, I said, my voice steady. I got married 5 months ago. You all got invitations. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it could break the table legs. Understand why I dropped a nuclear bomb on Thanksgiving dinner. And why I don't regret a single second of the fallout. I have to back up. My name is Elena. I'm 28 and I work as a landscape architect. My job is literally to design things that feel natural. Things that blend in so well you forget they were built by human hands. I was born for this job because I spent my entire childhood mastering the art of making myself invisible. In my family, there was a strict ecosystem that we all adhered to. My sister, Sarah, was the sun. She was the cheerleader, the prom queen, the one whose lifestyle brand was being curated before Instagram even existed. I was just orbit. I was the one holding the reflector so the lighting hit Sarah's cheekbones just right. I wasn't jealous, exactly. I just thought that was the rule. One child shines, the other supports. By the time we were adults, the dynamic was concrete. Sarah needed constant validation phone calls about her hair, her boyfriends, her stress, or her follower count. If I had a crisis or a promotion or a bad day, my mother would listen for 30 seconds before pivoting back to Sarah. That's nice, honey, but did you hear Sarah's audition got rescheduled? She's devastated. I learned to stop sharing. I moved to the city, rented a loft with drafty windows, and focused on my blueprints. That's where I met Mark. Mark was different. He was a carpenter who smelled like sawdust and Old Spice. He didn't look through me, he looked at me. On our third date, he remembered I hated cilantro without me having to remind him. On our 6-month anniversary, he remembered the name of the obscure fern I mentioned once in passing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't background noise. I was the main event. When Mark proposed on a rainy Tuesday in our living room, it wasn't a production, it was just us. We decided right then, no big spectacle. We wanted a small ceremony in the botanical gardens where I worked. Just 40 people. Intimate, real, but even though I had built a separate life, that old, desperate child inside me still wanted my parents to be there. I wanted them to see me happy. I wanted them to choose me just for one day. I designed the invitations by hand. I used heavy, cream-colored cardstock and pressed real wildflowers into the paper. I handwrote the addresses in calligraphy I'd practiced for weeks. I packed the invitation for my parents and Sarah, who was living at home to save money for her brand, into a sturdy envelope. I didn't just drop it in a mailbox. I paid extra for priority tracking. I paid for signature required. I wanted zero margin for error. I remember standing at the post office counter, watching the clerk scan the barcode. I felt this swell of hope in my chest. I thought, this is it. This is the start of them finally seeing me. I walked out of that post office believing the hard part was over. I had no idea that the tracking number in my pocket was going to become the most important piece of evidence I would ever own. The notification popped up on my phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was inspecting a site survey. Delivered. Signed by S. Bennett. I stared at the screen, letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for a week. Sarah had signed for. It was in the house. The physical proof of my happiness was now sitting on the kitchen counter where I grew up. I imagined my mother opening the thick envelope, running her fingers over the pressed wildflowers, maybe tearing up a little. I imagined my father clearing his schedule. I imagined Sarah finally realizing that my life wasn't a threat to hers. I waited for the call. I kept my phone volume on high, jumping every time it buzzed. But Tuesday turned into Wednesday. Wednesday. Turned into the weekend. Nothing. I started telling myself little stories to fill the silence. Maybe they were planning a surprise engagement party for me. Maybe they were waiting to RSVP until they bought their flights. Maybe they were just busy. Sarah was deep in the planning of her own massive September wedding after all. 2 weeks. Out. I finally broke. I called my mother. It went to voicemail. I texted the family group chat. Hey everyone, just checking if you got the mail. Need final head count soon. 3 hours later, my dad replied, busy at work. We'll check later. That was it. No congratulations. No, we're so excited. Just a dismissal. The wedding day arrived in late May. It was a misty, ethereal morning, exactly what Mark and I wanted. The botanical garden was in full bloom, smelling of rain and jasmine. I wore a simple slip dress I'd found at a vintage shop, and when Mark saw me, he cried. It should have been perfect. But as I walked down the grassy aisle, my eyes involuntarily flicked to the front row on the bride's side. It was empty. 3 white folding chairs sat vacant, creating a gap that felt like a missing tooth. Mark's family was there in full force. His mother, Helen, hugged me so hard I thought my ribs might crack. She whispered, "You're our daughter now," and she meant it. But every time I looked at those 3 empty chairs, I felt a familiar hollow ache. In my chest, they hadn't just declined. They had ghosted me. On the most important day of my life, my family hadn't bothered to show up, call, or even send a card. I got through the day by clinging to Mark. We danced, we ate cake, we laughed with our friends. But underneath the joy, a cold, hard stone was forming in my stomach. Weeks passed after the wedding. The silence from my parents shifted from hurtful to strange. It wasn't just that they missed the wedding. It was that they were acting like it never happened. I saw photos of them on social media at brunches, at golf outings, at dress fittings for Sarah. They were living their lives loud and clear, and I had been completely erased. I was washing dishes one night in July, angrily scrubbing a pan when I finally said it out loud. Why do they hate me, Mark? I sent them the invite. Sarah signed for it. Why would they just ignore me? Mark was drying a plate next to me. He stopped, his towel hovering in midair. He looked at me with a frown that wasn't angry but confused. Elena, he said slowly, are you absolutely sure they saw it? Sarah signed for it, I snapped, feeling defensive. I have the proof. I know Sarah signed for the package, Mark said, his voice dropping an octave. But did your parents ever actually mention seeing the invitation themselves? Did they ever say the words, "We received it"? I froze. I replayed the last 3 months in my head. The vague texts. The dodged calls. The weird, evasive answers. No, I whispered. They never did. Mark set the plate down. I think we need to look at the digital logs again. Not just the tracking number. We need to check the email server. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what he was suggesting, and the possibility was so cruel I didn't want to believe it. But I dried my hands and walked to the computer. I had the password to my parents' family email account because, ironically, I was the one who set it up for them years ago. I hadn't logged in since I moved out, but my fingers remembered the keys. Mark pulled a chair up next to me. The screen glowed blue in the dark room, casting shadows on his face. Search for your name, he said quietly. I typed Elena into the search bar. Nothing in the inbox. Nothing in the spam folder. Check the trash, Mark said. And check the recover deleted. Items log. I clicked. The screen refreshed and my heart hammered against my ribs. There, buried in a list of junk mail and newsletters, was the digital save the date I had sent back in January as a backup to the paper invites. Status. Opened. Time. January 14th, 4:12 p.m. Action. Move to trash. Action. Permanently delete it. Wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had opened my email, read it, and then scrubbed it from existence before my parents ever saw it. Look at the device login. Mark pointed to the metadata on the side of the screen. iPhone 14 Pro. Who has that phone? I didn't even have to answer. My dad used an old Android. My mom barely knew how to text. Sarah was the only one who upgraded. Her phone every September like clockwork. I sat back, feeling sick. The pieces were clicking together into a picture so ugly I didn't want to look at it. Sarah didn't just forget to give them the mail. She intercepted the physical package, signed. for it hid it and then monitored the email account to make sure no digital traces got through. She had built a firewall around my parents to keep me out. I pulled up the tracking receipts again. 4 separate packages, all signed S. Bennett. She had caught every single attempt I made to reach them. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. Just... why? Look at the dates, Mark said, his voice hard. Your wedding was May, hers is October. If your parents knew about yours, they would have been talking about it all spring. They would have been buying outfits, planning travel, spending money. She didn't want the competition, I realized, the nausea turning into cold rage. She wanted her wedding year to be exclusively hers. She erased my marriage so hers could shine brighter. Mark stood up and paced the room. This is sociopathic, Elena. You can't let this slide. You have to tell them. I looked at the calendar on the wall. It was November. Thanksgiving, I said. What? They invited us to Thanksgiving. Probably just to keep up appearances so they can brag about Sarah's wedding to the extended family. They expect me to show up, smile, and play the supportive little sister. I looked at Mark. I'm going. Mark stopped pacing. He looked at the evidence on the screen, then back at me. If we go, we aren't going to make peace. No, I said, grabbing my phone to screenshot everything. The signatures, the deleted emails, the device IDs, we're going to make a scene. Pause for a moment. I want to know what you guys think. Was I being too harsh planning to ruin a holiday over this? Or did they deserve it? Tell me in the comments. The drive to my parents' house that Thursday felt like a military operation. Mark drove in silence, his hand resting protectively on my knee. I had my phone fully charged and the screenshots organized in a folder labeled The Truth. We pulled into the driveway. The house looked picture perfect. A wreath on the door, warm yellow lights spilling from the windows, luxury cars lining the street. It was the setting of every happy childhood memory I pretended to have. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror. I didn't look like the invisible little sister anymore. I looked like a woman who had nothing left to lose. Ready? Mark asked. Killing the engine. I took a deep breath, clutching my purse and the evidence inside it like a weapon. Let's go eat, I said. Chapter 4. The Feast of Lies Thanksgiving always looked perfect from the outside white tablecloth. Polished silver, a centerpiece of autumn gourds that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. But the moment I stepped through the door, I felt it, that old, unspoken tension settling over my shoulders like a heavy coat I never asked to wear. Sarah was already posing for photos near the fireplace, her fiancé holding a glass of champagne while she adjusted her hair for the perfect angle. My mother was fussing over the turkey, narrating every detail of Sarah's upcoming nuptials to anyone within earshot. My father poured wine mechanically, his eyes already looking tired. Not one person asked how I'd been. Not one person mentioned that I hadn't visited in months. I took my seat at the table directly across from Sarah. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. Silence can be a performance, and she'd always been the star. Dinner began with the usual script. Praise for Sarah's dress choice, her venue, her guest list, her connections. Every sentence was a reminder that they'd shown up for her, over and over without hesitation, while they couldn't be bothered to acknowledge a single detail of my life. Then the moment came. The moment I had been waiting for since I walked. In the door dot, my mother tapped her glass with a spoon. Sarah's tasting menu was just divine, she said brightly, glancing at my sister as if to confirm. Then she turned her eyes to me. So Elena ... Seeing all this planning, when are you going to have your big day? When's yours? The table chuckled softly. Even the carving knife in my father's hand paused. Sarah kept her eyes on her plate, too. Still, too careful. That told me everything. For years, I would have laughed it off, let the jab slip under my skin, and pretended it didn't hurt. But not this time. Not after everything she'd buried. I set my fork down gently. I already had mine, I said, my voice cutting through the laughter like a razor. 6 months ago. The shift in the room was immediate. The air got sucked out. I waited a beat, let the silence land, then added, You got the invitations. Forks. Froze. Eyes widened. My mother's smile collapsed into confusion. My father blinked like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Across from me, Sarah finally looked up, terror flashing behind her eyes. Elena, my father said carefully. We never... Got any invitations? There it was. The lie, or rather, the ignorance born from the lie. I figured you'd say that, I replied softly. I reached into my bag, not rushing, not dramatic, and placed my phone on the table. The screen glowed, reflecting in the wine glasses. This is the line I'm finally drawing. I tapped the screen to open the gallery. These are the delivery receipts from the postal service. I rotated the phone so the entire table could see. 4 packages, priority mail, signature required. Delivered April 23rd. I zoomed in on the signature box. Signed by S. Bennett. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Sarah's fiancé. Stiffened, looking from the phone to Sarah like he was seeing a stranger. Sarah, my father whispered, I don't remember. Sarah stammered, her face flushing red. Maybe I grabbed the mail all the time. I probably just set them down and forgot. It was an accident. An accident? I swiped to the next image. Then, explain this. I pulled up the email logs Mark and I had uncovered. This is the family email account. My save the date was opened, moved to trash, and permanently deleted on January 14th from an iPhone 14 Pro. I looked directly at Sarah. Who is the only person at this table with an iPhone 14 Pro? Sarah's mouth opened and closed. She looked like a trapped animal. You deleted them, I said, my voice dead calm. You intercepted the mail. You scrubbed the emails. You made sure Mom and Dad missed my wedding completely. Why would she do that? My mother cried out, looking between us, desperate for another explanation. That makes no sense. Why would Sarah hide your wedding? Because hers is in October, I said, not breaking eye contact with my sister. And she didn't want to share the year. Sarah slammed her hands on the table, tears springing to her eyes, tears of rage, not guilt. You always make everything about you. My wedding is going to be huge. Yours was probably some backyard thing anyway. Why does it matter? It matters, I said, standing up, because they're my parents too. Or at least they were supposed to be. It matters, I repeated, my voice steady despite the shaking of my hands, because you erased me. Sarah's face crumpled, but not with remorse. It was the panic of a spoiled child getting caught. I didn't mean to erase you. I just ... I put the invites in a drawer because I was overwhelmed. And then time passed and it got awkward and I just thought, it's better if they focus on my wedding. You're always so quiet anyway. I didn't think you'd care this much. You didn't think I'd care that my own parents missed my wedding? I asked incredulously. We didn't know. My father stood up, his face gray. Elena, you have to believe us. If we had known, we would have been there. We would have dropped everything. But you didn't know, I said. And why is that? Because for 20 years, you've let Sarah filter everything that comes into this house. You let her curate the family narrative. You never checked, you never asked. You just assumed that if Sarah didn't mention it, it wasn't important. My mother reached out, tears streaming down her face. We can fix this. We can throw you a reception now. We can do it next summer, after Sarah's... Stop. I cut her off. Do you hear yourself? After Sarah's? It's always after Sarah. I looked at them, really looked at them, and realized something that made the anger evaporate, leaving only exhaustion. I didn't lose my family tonight, I said, picking up my coat. I just stopped pretending I had one. Elena, don't go. My dad pleaded, moving toward me. We can talk about this. We're talking, I said, buttoning my coat. For the first time. You guys did your best for Sarah. For me, you did the bare minimum and called it fairness. I walked to the door. I heard Sarah sobbing loudly behind me, a performance to the very end. I heard my mother muttering my name like a prayer, but I didn't turn back. I opened the door, letting the cold November air rush in to clear the suffocating scent of turkey and lies. You didn't miss my wedding, I said, pausing one last time on the threshold. You just never looked for it. I stepped out and closed the door. A clean final line drawn in the sand dot mark was waiting by the car. He didn't ask what happened. He just opened the passenger door, wrapped his arms around me, and held me until the shaking stopped. The next morning, we didn't wake up to a hangover of guilt. We woke up to the smell of bacon. Mark's parents had invited us over for leftover breakfast. There was no ceremony, no tension, no walking on eggshells. Helen squeezed my hand over coffee and said, "Your family here, Elena. Not because you married my son, but because you're you." A week later, I got a long, rambling email from Sarah. It was full of therapy words, validation, trauma, space, but no actual apology. I deleted it without replying. My dad called a few times. I let it go to voicemail. Then, a month later, a small envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was one of my original wedding invitations, the cream cardstock bent at the corner. My dad had found it. He dug through Sarah's drawers or storage boxes until he found the proof. He mailed it to me without a note. It was the closest thing to "I believe you" that he could muster. I looked at that invitation, then I looked at my living room. Mark was laughing on the phone with his brother. The house was warm. The silence here wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. I used to believe family was something you protected, no matter what it cost you. But standing there, I finally understood the truth. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shares your life. It's who shows up. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the people who never learned how to hold you. Subscribe for more karma stories and see you in the next video.